Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. My presentation today is about language-specific storytelling strategies. It's a study that examined the Chinese ESL learners' narrative structure and evaluation function. So first, let me start with introducing some of the background information on this topic. In the field of second language acquisition, there's a very well-established theory called cross-linguistic influence. It essentially argues that people's knowledge in their first language often influence their use and learning of a second language. So it argues that both linguistic and conceptual knowledge within people's first language are highly likely to be transferred to their use of a second language. So linguistic knowledge is kind of easy to understand. It refers to our knowledge about vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, things like this. And conceptual knowledge refers to the way that we conceptualize experiences in our first language. So there are substantial studies showing that linguistic and conceptual features in L1 are highly likely to be transferred to the use of second language, and this phenomenon is referred to as the language transfer. Another thing to know is regarding to narrative is that story schemata are culture specific. In other words, people from different cultures tend to tell stories differently. For example, they may structure their stories differently, or they may choose to highlight different aspects of their story. So, a good story in one culture is not necessarily equally good in another culture. And this is the back. There is a research gap emerged in the literature. Whether the way that people tell stories in their first language influence the way that they tell stories in a second language remain unclear. In other words, although there are substantial studies reporting language transfer within wide variety of discourse types, narrative actually received relatively less research attention, and this is actually the motivation for me to do this study. So the purpose of my study is to explore whether Chinese ESL learners' written narratives follow a culture-specific schema, and second, whether the narrative schema used in their Chinese narratives transfer to their English narratives. So essentially, I have two focuses. The first one is to establish a culture-specific storytelling strategy, and the second one is to look for evidence for any language transfer between Chinese and English writings. So this is a quantitative study. I recruited 40 college students as my participants. 20 of them were native English speakers and 20 of them were Chinese ESL learners. I asked them to do a writing task on their most frightening experience. So for the 20 native English speakers, I asked them to write in English, and for the 20 Chinese ESL learners, I first asked them to write in English, and then in a 2 weeks interval, I asked them to write about the same story in Chinese again. So by the end of the data collection, I've collected a total number of 60 written essays with 40 of them in English and 20 of them in Chinese. After I collected all the writings, I coded them based on the high point coding scheme, which was developed by Labov and Vlasky, and it has become a very popular tool for any narrative analysis studies. So basically, all of the writings were coded based on three general categories. First one is narrative length, second, narrative structure, and the third, evaluation function. The findings of the study will be also reported based on these three categories. The first one is narrative length. Narrative length is evaluated by the number of clauses, and although we don't actually see any statistical significance here, but just by looking at the numbers, it kind of gives us general impression that native English speakers tend to produce a little bit longer stories than the Chinese participants. This is about narrative length. In next category is narrative structure. Narrative structure is basically evaluated did based on these subcategories. For example, orientation, event, explicit evaluation, descriptives, and duratives. Here, I would like to draw your attention to this explicit evaluation because we do observe some statistical significance between the two language groups. Um, Explicit evaluation refers to the use of a language to directly express the character's feelings or emotions in the story. For example, something like, I was so scared or I was shocked. These are coded into explicit evaluation. And here we observe a pattern that native English speakers tend to produce more explicit evaluation clauses comparing to the Chinese participants. And this is actually inconsistent with our hypothesis and some findings of previous cross-cultural studies. Those cross-cultural studies found that Asian people, especially Eastern Asian people, are more reserved about their personal feelings compared to Westerners. So, in other words, when they're writing, they tend to present the fact and keep the feelings to themselves rather than express them, say them out loud, just like what native English speakers did. So our little pattern here actually corroborate with the previous cross-cultural findings on this. The next results comes from evaluation function. Evaluation function refers to the author's ability to include linguistic devices to make their stories more vivid and more accessible to the readers. So as you can see, here are some subcategories. For example, mental states, physical actions, intensifiers, hedges, direct and indirect reported speeches, character delineation, adverbs, and I also added them up to see like any general patterns would reveal. So when we look at these individual categories, we don't see any statistical significance. However, when we add them up, we do observe some significance between the native English speaker and the ESL group. So it looks like that native English speakers tend to use more evaluation device in their story comparing to the Chinese participants. It indicates that when native English speakers writing a narrative, they tend to include a variety of linguistic resources to make their stories a little bit more relatable to the reader. Comparatively, Chinese participants tend to just write the story as a series of events, rather than use a lot of linguistic resources to make the story may sound more vivid or descriptive to the reader. So these are the findings of the study, and in conclusion, first, I do find culture-specific story schema within Chinese ESL learners' Chinese writings. For example, they use less explicit evaluation and they use less evaluation devices. The second one is I found evidence for cross-linguistic influence because I also did a correlation analysis between Chinese ESL learners' Chinese writings and English writings. And I found that a positive correlation exists between ESL and NC writings, specifically for the evaluation function category. It means that when writing a story, the way or the habit that Chinese ESL learners used when they're writing a story in Chinese is also observed to be transferred when they're writing a story in English. So this is the study. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you very much.